Just last week, I was meeting with Andy Clarkson, the SVP of Product and Tech at NBCUniversal, and he said, you know what? Platform has to do two things. It has to play the video and collect the money. The reality is underneath that it's super complex.
Welcome, everyone. This is Streaming Made Easy. I'm Marion Rancher, and you know I like to talk with amazing people, and so I've brought someone amazing for you. The only problem is there's no way that I can pronounce his name. Okay, so you're going to be Tom for me today. Thank you so much for coming on board. So this is part of a series of conversation that I'm having with industry folks around key pain points that we're facing. I'm really pain first, so to say. I always want to understand the problem. And I'm always trying to look for people who have a specific solution to a specific problem. And so let's get to the bottom of this. Do you want to share with me the problem you're trying to solve? And I think that's the opportunity for you to tell me more about the company you work at.
Sure. No. So, all these OTT streaming providers are competing for engagement, as you know. And just last week, I was meeting with Andy Clarkson, the SVP of Product and Tech at NBCUniversal, and he said, you know what? He tells his team, the platform has to do two things. It has to play the video and collect the money. The reality is underneath that it's super complex. And one would argue that OTT streaming platforms are some of the most complex consumer-facing technology challenges out there. And that's why I love your name. I came to you when you said streaming made easy. I said, actually, streaming isn't easy. And Teslio helps make streaming easy for product and technology leaders globally. So, that's at the start. What we have is a managed crowd testing service that allows streaming leaders to burst into testers on any device, in any language, in any location, with any payment method across the globe.
The company, where is it based? Where is it from?
So we're originally an Estonian company. We were founded 13 years ago by an amazing woman named Crystal Krusek, who is still very active in the company. She went over to the U.S. With an incubator, and so we were sort of a U.S.-Estonian company. And we got pulled into media and entertainment very early because of these challenges. It's one of our largest, fastest growing segments. We've really become the de facto standard to supplement in-house quality assurance to ensure that they're delivering flawless streaming services across the globe, and they're able to take the money, that the payments work, because not everybody pays with Visa and MasterCard across the globe.
So at the top, you were saying that so streaming is not easy, unlike the newsletter, but we want to make it easier. So it's not easy. Everyone is chasing a global scale. But to do that, you need to have a product that actually, can ship across the globe. And to your point, there's a lot of, small things that perhaps we don't pay attention to that needs to be localized, whether that's, the interface in the local language, the local payment method, etc. The question I have for you is, this is a problem that, many face, and I'm sure many others than you are trying to tackle. So what's your edge? What are you doing differently than others?
So Teslio is a professional managed crowd testing service. There are many companies in the world that can do that. One way we're different, and this was Crystal's innovation, is we set a high bar, so we only accept sort of 3% who apply to us, and ignore the 97%. And we also pay our testers by the hour rather than by the bug. And so what this provides streaming providers, so think about like Sky Portugal. They're the NBC Universal's global streaming technology team, and they support SkyShowtime, Peacock, Showmax Africa, now Wow TV. They're in 80 different countries. So they have testers in Portugal. They've automated 90% of it. They shift left, they do the automation, they burst into their 30 or so testers, and then for a release, and then they still burst into us overnight or over weekends to cover all these devices across the globe. Like they may say, hey, we need a Fire TV in America, this version. We need a UView S set-top box in the UK. We need a Ziggo set-top box in the Netherlands. We need somebody paying with Momo in the Netherlands, right? So they can burst. They don't have people in those countries with those devices who can actually be their insight into whether or not it's working. So instead of, like Arsenal told me, like, we used to test on our supporters, but you give us supporters who test. And so that's really our distinct differentiation. And we also provide testers who come in with a, how can I break this mindset? And they can do things like have Charles Proxy Log and Wireshark and all these things that give actual videos and logs and data saying, here's the problem. And give you some more examples about that in a minute.
It's fascinating. To the point we made, originally the number of video destination, right, has gone, tenfold, if well, hundredfold, a thousandfold, whatever. But aside from that, those streaming services are landing on distribution platform across the world, and we're looking at a variety of devices. Not only that, but those devices are staying in home several years. You look at a set-top box, you look at a TV, and so the question is not just, does my service work right now on XYZ, but does it still work when I bring this new feature on those specific devices? Does it work on older devices, et cetera, et cetera? So there is no way anyone could do that with a team of testers. I mean, your office would be just a giant Walmart, right?
Well, I've been to these offices, and even Fortune 40 companies, whether it's a Comcast or BBC, they have hundreds of devices and they still rely on us. So I'll give you an example. When SkyShowtime was launched, 22 countries, 18 languages, over 5 months, they burst into our testers across those countries. They weren't just testing the localization and and the payment methods and all that, but they used over 1,500 device OS combinations from our network. And those testers bring those devices to actually make sure it works. Because as you say, when you buy a TV, a connected TV in particular, it tends to stay on your wall for at least 8 years. So you have to support that for at least 8 years. And then on top of it, all these companies, whether it's Apple TV and Amazon Fire or Google or Samsung or LG, not to mention the other ones, there's so many, TiVo OS, NVIDIA, and so forth. They're coming out with new operating systems all the time, right? So you have this long tail and these new releases that you have to support because your subscribers have all these devices. And unlike this, that I can turn around and swap it out today and put it in my pocket, it's not so easy with a television.
All right. So essentially, you're helping those platform test at scale, without needing to have a million devices in a single office. How deep do you go into what you test, right? Because I've heard you mentioning the localization for SkyShowtime, or you mentioned app compatibility or payment methods. Is there anything else that you're looking into?
Well, we do let's take Peacock as an example. We do signal testing with them and for others as well. So what we do is we look at their app reviews and we can take those in as a signal, sort of filter them out and say, we're seeing a bunch of 1-2-star ratings on Samsung 2018 TVs. And so they'll burst into one of our testers in America with that model, and they'll pay them for an hour, which is super economical, rather than having somebody in India for 40 hours a week twiddling her thumbs, right? And that person, because they're a professional seasoned tester, they'll go around and find what I call the snake in the grass. And they'll say, I found it. Here is the issue that's causing problems that's leading to those 1- and 2-star reviews. Because if you have 41 million subscribers like Peacock, a fraction of a percent is still tens of thousands of users. And every one of those, if they're having a bad experience, could churn, or et cetera. So we then find the issue, give them videos, logs, et cetera, and say, here's the issue. That gets fed into their engineering team, which I would argue for streaming provider is like their most valuable resource, right? Those video engineers need to be advancing the platform because expectations are being set by the world's largest tech companies. And they find that super valuable, and they're constantly reducing churn and increasing their customer NPS.
So when you say signal, that means it's not looking for bugs, but more. So there's the bug, fixing, but it's like even the experience people actually have. It could be that it's not a bug, but it does not work, in Spain the same way it works in France, and one feature that was built a specific way is going to rub people the wrong way in a given market. Is that what you mean when you mean signal?
100%. So we did a webinar with Nicole Kittle-Bro, who's runs localization for Roku, and we do all their localization testing. And I liked her phrase, which was, we Roku want to make sure that that for our end users, it appears that our service is made for their market, not just translated for it. Right. So the way they do that is by they burst into Testlio testers across the globe who can say, or like the NBA is one of our customers, and they have a streaming service, in their app, right? And so we've been working with them for years, and we can say, the way you've translated alley-oop is not the term that the kids in Brazil are using that, you want to attract, right? So that's sort of made for the market, not just translated for the market, cascade. So that's localization testing, but it's also payment testing, right? In Brazil, people pay with Pix. They don't just, as Sky said, we think crowd testing is the ideal way to do payment testing. And, and another platform told me you can't just pass around the corporate Amex card, right? They get their IP blocked for doing all, doing all this testing. So instead they can burst into us. We say, well, we have testers in the Netherlands who use Ideal. We have testers, in Nigeria who pay with Momo. Right. And so we got pulled into that, just sort of like we did it because we had the crowd. People started seeing, oh, wait a minute, that these can be the eyes and ears of our development and product development lifecycle for us in all the countries we operate.
Yeah, so there's the ship and you check before, but there's that iterative process between you guys where it could be that you're feeding them new insights for future rollouts, right?
Yeah. So we're in constant engagement with them. So, we're a subscription business. Our customers, whether they're releasing every 2 weeks or down to 1 week, they'll burst into us. We can do 0 business hour testing. So in the case of Sky, for example, they give us a release on Wednesday at 4:00. We smoke test it, and then we burst into they go home. We burst into maybe 50 testers across the world. Depends on which devices and countries they're interested in that evening. They wake up the next morning and they see that in Jira, here are the 12 issues that Teslio found last night. So we're actually shortening their release development process, and then they can either feature flag the issues off or fix the issue quickly, and then have our testers validate did that fix work. So that's really the power of the burstability. And you can't really do that if you have a legion of testers in India, full time.
You mentioned someone from NBC, didn't catch his name, but he said there's 2 things you should do, play the video and bring the money. So my question is, once you've done that job, right, the fixing or the improving, how does that translate? Do you have any data into how, your customers are actually seeing the business case? Because it's always a question of, what's the business impact of any technology investment improvements?
Yeah, so we just published a case study this month on our website with Hallmark Plus, which Hallmark is a streaming service, over 1 million subscribers in the U.S. They've been a customer for over 5 years, and they recently quantified for us that they've seen over per year $1.34 million in savings between avoided revenue loss, churn, and support costs, as well as device equipment they'd have to buy. So it's the ROI is there. On top of it, it's burstable, right? So you're getting all these testers in the countries you need to operate with, the payment methods and the devices that and you're only paying when they're time on task, right? So the ROI is enormous, which is really why we've become the de facto standard in the OTT streaming space.
So Tom, we're going to be together in Lisbon for StreamTV Europe, and you're bringing amazing people to talk about this exact topic. Do you want to tell us more?
Yeah, super excited to have you moderate it. Well, I think the title of the panel is "Works in the Lab, Breaks on the Couch," like how leaders avoid that. So we have 2 product and technology leaders from leading global platform providers for big media companies. So we have Antonio Vieira, who's the SVP Director of Global App Engineering. That's for NBC Universal's global streaming technology team. That team is based in Lisbon, Portugal. They do the apps for, like we talked about, Peacock, SkyShowtime, Now TV, Wow TV, Showmax, Africa, etc. He'll be there. And then Sylviane Lecomte, I'm sure I butchered her name because I'm not a French speaker, who's the chief design and experience officer for Bedrock Streaming. Bedrock is to Bertelsmann RTL what Antonio is to NBC Universal, right? So they are the streaming platform for RTL Plus and Videoland and M6 Plus. So both of those are customers of ours. Super excited to have them share their insights on how they deliver flawless streaming experiences to multiple clients across the globe.
Awesome. And so, we've spoken about what you've done, where you're at right now. What is your number one, goal this year and beyond? What are you trying to achieve within this vertical that is media and entertainment? Because you've mentioned that you're catering to different ecosystems, but this is where perhaps you're the biggest. What are you trying to achieve as a company? And I will say more specifically within Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Europe is there's so many countries and broadcasters and streaming services, and streaming isn't just the SkyShowtimes and the Now TVs and the RTL Pluses of the world. It's also, the sport, the Arsenal, there's the Man U TV, all these other customers of ours in sports leagues. So really just making everybody aware of Teslio's crowd testing service and how it really, how the other leaders are using it. I remember I worked at a prior company. There's sort of leaders and laggards, right? And I think it's a bit of too much of a well-kept secret. And with your help and this, by having customers on the panel sharing how they supplement their in-house teams, they automate, they have big teams, they have big labs, and they still see tremendous value that they cannot replicate by bursting into Teslio's crowd testers. And it doesn't just have to be the NBC's 80 countries of the world. Will Jones, the SVP of product of BritBox from BBC Studios, he and I did a webinar recently. He used us for his relaunch of BritBox 2.0 in Australia, Canada, and the US. And he's like, it's invaluable to us because how else would we know that it's working there? And we always find all sorts of issues that they can solve, and they don't want to test on their end users or have churn. So just helping people be aware that this exists and that they should be a leader and use it like the other leaders and don't lag behind by missing it.
I feel very strongly about Europe. So I think we need to end this conversation on a key trend that is, important to you guys and to the company as a whole. When you're looking at this ecosystem, what is that?
Well, I mean, I'm hugely passionate about Europe as well as Teslio's leader in Europe. And I mean, we're a female-founded European company. So the big difference here is Europe has the scale across all the 27 or more countries. So there's either pan-European operators or they're very local providers, or there's semi-regional. So like Magenta TV for Deutsche Telekom in 6 or 7 countries. So what I do see is for the national broadcasters, if they're only operating in their one country, they think I've got this under control, and they probably do. But the minute you start to expand to 3 or 4 or 5 countries, like crowd testing is a fit, right? Because the reality is the expectations for the streaming service are being set by the world's largest tech companies, right? They're all in this space. And so if you want to compete for their engagement and the end user's engagement and attention, you can put all the ads on the buses, you can do all the tune in advertising you want. And I keep going to all these shows and it's like, oh, engagement. But if they can't actually see your app on their TV in their country and pay for it, then what's it all for, right? And so there's just so much complexity to it. I'm gonna go to the Connected TV World Summit, and every year I've gone, unlike the mobile world, which is consolidated down to 2 operating systems, every year there's a new operating system in the Connected TV, OS world, and there's a reason for that, which this may be another topic. But that means if you're a streaming provider in one country or 3 or 80, it's very complex. And you really cannot have enough internal resources or labs to make sure that to duplicate your end users' environments and make sure it works. So that's where crowd testing of no matter what your size, it's so economical because you're only paying time on task really that it really is a fit for everybody, and especially in Europe.
I think you have a good business there because I talk a lot about fragmentation, and you've mentioned CTV. It is getting more fragmented by the day, and clearly there's more complexity coming, our way than ever before. So I think you're onto something. What I will leave people with is the first company I built was called the Local Acts, and it really drew from my experience working with a U.S. company, and perhaps that lack of understanding of how the rest of the world works, and how localization matters in many more ways than one might imagine, and it's just not the language. And so I think that what you need, and what you said at the top about people lagging behind, I think that people have a narrow understanding of what localization is. And so right now, a lot of the streaming operators, the stakeholders, focus on distribution, which I love. It's a topic I love. Making sure that the content is both produced locally or dubbed and localized. But that's it. There's little understanding that there's this one last mile to put the product in the hands of the consumer. And that's where, it makes or breaks, right? You've said it. If the payment method doesn't work, or if there's something in the way, the usability of the product, kudos to you guys for having the vision. And I love the fact that you're working in at scale like that by gathering crowds instead of trying to replicates essentially a QA lab somewhere else for your customers.
Crystal's innovation 13 years ago out of Estonia is really, it still stands the test of time. Even as companies automate 90%, they still want that last mile, maybe we should say last kilometer, or even the last 2 or 3 meters. And just how else do you know that it's going to work? So, if you want their engagement, they have to be able to get, into the service and watching it on their device that's their, that they've chosen in their living room or in their pocket.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much for being here. For anyone watching, we're going to be at StreamTV Europe in a few weeks' time. There's still time to actually use my code SME10. It gets you, a 10% discount on the badge. So always nice to take and spend on, pasties and whatever else you want to engage with in Portugal. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.